Despite the changes brought about by 2 centuries of European settlement, Australia remains very much a land of birds, rivaling any other continent in the range and diversity of its avifauna. Each of Australia's varied landscapes, from inland deserts to coastal heaths and rainforests, from the tropical wetlands of the north to the high country of the southeast, has its own particular mix of species. Nearly 400 species of birds are entirely confined to Australia. Others breed elsewhere in the world but regularly migrate here for the winter. The exact grand total of Australia's inventory of bird species is endlessly debatable, but stands somewhere around 750. Worldwide groups like ducks and hawks are well represented. But entirely endemic groups, such as emus and lyrebirds, also abound. And Australia is the centre of distribution of several especially widespread, diverse and colourful groups, notably the parrots and the honey-eaters. What follows is a sample of this diversity, a 1-minute glimpse at the lives and behaviour of 101 representatives of this fascinating assembly. This, in short, is a parade of some of the more prominent members of the community of Australian birds. Emus are grazing birds, competing with kangaroos in diet and the kinds of country they inhabit. But unlike kangaroos, they forage by day rather than at night. Extremely vulnerable to drought, during hard times the birds often congregate in large mobs and wander far from their home range. They seldom seek the shade and must visit water frequently to drink. One of the bird icons of Australia, the emu is by far the tallest native Australian bird, but not necessarily the biggest. Standing about 2 meters in height, emus may weigh up to 50 kilograms. But old female southern cassowaries sometimes weigh as much as 60 kilograms. Extensive deep Kumbungi swamps in the Riverina are the stronghold of the great crested grebe in Australia, though it also occurs sparingly elsewhere in the east and south of the continent. Overseas, it has a wide distribution in Africa, Europe and Asia, and it also occurs in New Zealand. The bird is easily recognized by its crest and ornate facial ruff, and females resemble males very closely in appearance. Like all grebes, it is strongly aquatic, obtaining virtually all of its food by pursuing it underwater. The diet consists of fish and other small aquatic animals. It is reluctant to fly and almost never comes ashore. Australia has several species of grebe, but the whitish grin mark at the base of the bill marks this one as the Australasian grebe. Grebes dive for their food, aquatic insects, small fish and similar prey, and build more or less floating nests moored to reeds or similar swamp vegetation. Baby grebes often ride on their parents' back, bobbing to the surface like corks when their mount dives from under them. This species favours small, secluded ponds, as well as quiet corners of more extensive wetlands, and is often common on ornamental ponds in city parks. The birds usually live in pairs that seldom leave their jointly held territories. The black-browed albatross is the most common of several albatross species in Australian waters, especially off southern and southeastern coasts. It's very much a bird of the open ocean, but sometimes, if time and circumstances are just right, it can be seen from land. In calm weather, albatrosses often rest on the surface of the sea, but otherwise they spend most of their time on the wing. This albatross is much easier to identify than most seabirds. Its underwing is mostly black, with only a relatively small area of smudgy white running down the centre. In most albatrosses, the underwing is almost entirely white. Although shearwaters of several kinds occur commonly in Australian waters, the wedge-tailed shearwater is the most numerous of them off the northern and eastern coasts, where it nests on many offshore islands. In autumn, it migrates northward to spend the winter in temperate regions of the North Pacific Ocean. Most shearwaters are similar in appearance and very difficult to identify at sea. But the wedge-tailed shearwater has a distinctive flight style, obvious even at great distances. The style is slow and easy, with much sailing and soaring up and down. The birds nest in burrows, dug into the ground on cliff tops and similar sites. Like most petrels and shearwaters, they visit their colonies only at night, coming ashore at sunset. The pelican is one of Australia's most unmistakable birds, as well as contending with the black swan for the title of Australia's largest flying bird. The bird occurs, at least casually, on wetlands almost everywhere across Australia. It also occurs locally along the east coast, especially after severe drought in the interior. Its long bill, with its enormous pouch used for scooping up small fish underwater, is unique. It nests in colonies on small islands, usually on wide, shallow salt lakes in the interior, but sometimes along the seacoast. The brown booby is a common bird of the coral cays and shallow seas of the Coral Sea, familiar to many holidaymakers on the Great Barrier Reef. It has an extensive distribution in tropical waters around the world, and it occurs, at least occasionally, all along the Australian coast north of the Tropic of Capricorn, especially after storms. Its brown hood and satin-white belly immediately distinguish it from any other seabird with which it might be confused. Like cormorants in more temperate waters, the brown booby forages in inshore waters and often loafs on harbour buoys and channel markers. A sort of avian submarine, the darter hunts underwater by lurking in wait for any unwary fish that might swim within reach. In this, it differs from its relatives, the cormorants, which pursue their underwater prey. Though its non-waterproof plumage helps maintain neutral buoyancy underwater, sooner or later it becomes too waterlogged to continue, and it must then haul out on some quiet log or snag, adopt its heraldic pose, and wait to dry out in the sun. Unlike cormorants, darters seldom occur in salt or brackish water. Males are largely black, but females and young have pale heads. Cormorants of all species are fond of loafing on snags and stubs in the water, with their wings outstretched in heraldic pose. And this one, the little pied cormorant, is no exception. Smaller than most, the little pied cormorant has a dull yellow, rather stubby bill that distinguishes it from other cormorants. Unlike its relatives, it usually hunts alone. Most cormorants feed on fish, but this species tends to prefer crayfish and yabbies. Despite their aquatic habits, cormorants do not have water-repellent plumage and must periodically leave the water to let their feathers dry. Little pied cormorants breed in colonies and build their nests in trees, often in Melaleuca swamps. Among the smallest of Australian cormorants, the little black cormorant occurs across the continent on wetlands of all kinds, large and small, though it tends to favour freshwater over brackish or saltwater environments. It appears entirely black in plumage and is most easily identified by its relatively long, slender bill. It often forages alone, but it also sometimes forms flocks to fish cooperatively, and it freely mixes with other cormorants when it comes ashore to rest and preen. Most widespread of all Australian herons, the white-faced heron wades in shallow water to feed on frogs, small fish and similar aquatic animals. It's familiar to many observers, especially because, while other herons and egrets tend to prefer extensive lagoons, swamps and billabongs, the white-faced heron will also visit almost any small pond or flooded roadside ditch to forage. It usually forages alone and often defends feeding territories against other herons. It nests in trees, usually in company with several other pairs. Herons and egrets can exploit one or other of two basic foraging strategies. The choice is to carefully stalk their prey or to stand patiently waiting for it to come within striking distance. The great egret is a grand master of the stand and wait technique, and it often stands in the shallows, utterly motionless for minutes on end. Its long legs mean that it can also wade in much deeper water than other egrets. It preys mainly on fish. Several Australian egret species are entirely white in plumage, but the great egret's extremely long, slender neck with a distinct kink midway along is a distinctive feature. Rufous night herons are common but seldom seen because they normally feed only at night and roost by day in trees, sheltering quietly in the densest foliage they can find. The bird ranges across Australia, including Tasmania, wherever suitable permanent wetlands occur. Adults are instantly identifiable by the unusual reddish, rufous colour of their upper parts. But young birds like this one are very different in appearance and confuse many a beginner birdwatcher. The little bittern is a secretive bird that even experienced birdwatchers seldom see. It is not particularly rare throughout its range in eastern and extreme southwestern Australia, but it's normally extremely reluctant to leave the cover of the dense Kumbungi stands that are its usual home. It preys largely on insects and small vertebrates, such as frogs, and it tends to be more active by night than by day. Adult males have diagnostic pinkish-buff wing patches, but females are much duller, and juvenile birds are strongly streaked. Close relative of the white stork of Europe, famous for its mythical role as deliverer of babies, the black-necked stork is Australia's sole representative of the stork family. Rivaling the brolga in size, it is one of Australia's largest flying birds. Commonly known as the jabiru, the black-necked stork was once common in wetlands across the continent, but has declined in the south and is now common only in the northern tropics. It feeds on aquatic animals of almost any species, but it has a special fondness for snakes. Confined to Australia, the straw-necked ibis is abundant and widespread across the continent. Straw-necked ibises usually feed and travel in large flocks, which forage over swampland or dry, grassy paddocks alike. The birds are especially attracted to swarms of locusts. Most breeding colonies are in large, secluded lignum swamps. Such colonies are sometimes enormous, numbering as much as several 100,000 nesting birds and sprawling over several square kilometres. The name comes from the unusually stiff yellowish feathers on the throat, which do indeed rather resemble old-fashioned drinking straws. Royal spoonbills live in small groups that wade in shallow water for food, fly in formation from one lagoon or swamp to another, and roost together at night in the branches of dead trees. Both sexes wear the loose, shaggy crest, which is lacking in immature birds. Their style of feeding is distinctive, sweeping their broad, spatulate bills from side to side to gather up yabbies, small fish and similar prey, and swallowing them with an abrupt backward toss of the head. Almost a symbol of the top end, the magpie goose is common across tropical northern Australia, and it also occurs in New Guinea. Once it occurred in Australia much further south than it does today, with substantial populations even in the Murray-Darling Basin. But overhunting and wetlands destruction forced a general retreat northwards. Today, it is gradually being re-established in parts of its former range in the south. Magpie geese almost always occur in large flocks, and a mob rising in thunderous alarm is one of the most memorable experiences of any excursion onto the tropical wetlands of the top end. Black swans are common on wetlands of all kinds right across Australia, but they're generally much more numerous in the south than in the north. Fully mature birds form pairs that last for life, but less stable bonds of various kinds are common among younger birds. Both parents cooperate in caring for the young. Black swans usually build their nests on small islets in shallow lagoons and swamps. The breeding season varies widely from place to place, but it's usually in early spring in the south and autumn in the north of Australia. The grey teal vies with the Pacific black duck for the title of the most numerous Australian duck. Pacific black duck occur in the widest variety of habitats, but grey teal are nearly as ubiquitous, often occurring in much larger flocks, and are strongly nomadic, likely to visit almost any stretch of floodwater, no matter how temporary. It also doesn't mind salt water, which Pacific black duck tend to avoid. Unlike many small ducks, male and female grey teal are nearly identical in plumage. The hardhead is common across Australia, though it generally prefers the largest, deepest and most permanent of wetlands. It's often seen in small groups, but it also sometimes forms very large flocks on large lakes. Plumage differences between the sexes are not especially well marked, but the female is noticeably paler and duller than the male. It dives for almost all of its food, which consists of a roughly equal mix of animal and vegetable material, such as seeds, aquatic insects and small fish. The pygmy geese make up a distinctive group of wildfowl, largely confined to tropical wetlands and strongly associated with water lilies and similar floating vegetation. The green pygmy goose is the most widespread of Australia's two species. These birds are strongly aquatic and usually remain well away from shore. Male and female are similar, But she is a much duller bird with a paler neck and less distinct white cheek patch. Pygmy geese live in small flocks that seldom leave their lagoons and billabongs, though they spend a good deal of time flying to and fro within their territories. Musk ducks are virtually unmistakable. They ride very low in the water, looking rather like dark, bulky submarines. Males are substantially bigger than females and are distinguished by a leathery pouch dangling from the chin. Like grebes, musk ducks are strictly aquatic and are seldom seen in flight. They almost never come ashore and dive for all of their food. This male launches into the opening stages of its bizarre courtship display. Leathery throat pouch fully inflated with air, the bird begins swimming in tight circles. It throws its tail forward, almost over its head, and kicks at the surface in vigorous, spasmodic jerks that send plumes of water jetting several meters to either side. The black-shouldered kite is one of Australia's most numerous and widespread birds of prey. It occurs almost everywhere across the continent except for Tasmania and hunts over open country of all kinds, from grassy plains to wasteland in major cities. Mostly it preys on large insects such as grasshoppers, but it also takes mice and similar small mammals and small reptiles such as skinks. Young birds resemble their parents except in showing a good deal of reddish-brown in their plumage. Held aloft on fluttering wings, it perches motionless in mid-air, peering at the ground, usually 10 or 20 meters below, until it spots a victim. Then it pounces. Australia has several large birds of prey, but only the wedge-tailed eagle has a long, full, diamond-shaped tail that looks so obvious in flight. Its wings span some 2.5 meters. Young eagles have pale and mottled plumage, but they tend to get darker as they mature, and birds over 6 or 7 years old look nearly black. Eagles feed mainly on small mammals, hunting them by soaring at great height and scanning the ground below for movement. But they also rely heavily on carrion and can sometimes be seen by the roadside, feasting on the carcass of some unfortunate beast killed by traffic. A typical falcon preys mainly on other birds, which it captures in mid-air by overwhelming them with sheer speed and skill in flight. Not so the brown falcon, which feeds mostly on large insects, such as locusts and small mammals, such as mice, and gets by with a much lazier approach to its hunting. It glides low over the ground, sometimes hovers clumsily, and is often encountered perched on roadside fences and telephone posts. One of Australia's most widespread and abundant birds of prey, the brown falcon is notorious among birdwatchers for its bewildering range of plumage states. Individuals may be dark brown or pale, or almost any stage in between. The Australian brush turkey is a member of a family of birds known as mound builders, because of their unique breeding habits. These birds do not build nests. Instead, the male builds a large mound of earth and leaf litter on the forest floor, raking it into a heap with his large feet. Females visit to lay their eggs and bury them in the mound, where they are incubated by warmth generated by the fermenting vegetation, and the chicks ultimately hatch and wander away without any parental involvement of any kind. The brush turkey is common in coastal and highland forests of eastern Australia, from Cape York to not far north of Sydney. Unlike most quail-like birds, the painted button quail inhabits woodlands rather than grasslands, and is particularly common where leaf litter is abundant and grazing by livestock inhibited. It is entirely terrestrial in habits and flies only when hard pressed by danger. Even then, it usually flies only 100 meters or so, low on rapid whirring wings. The birds live in pairs or small coveys, feeding on insects and seeds. Button quail are unusual among birds in that the female is larger and more boldly patterned than the male, and takes the initiative in courtship and breeding. Rails, like this buff-banded rail, are small, rather chicken-like birds that inhabit dense swamp and marsh vegetation. Because they're extremely secretive, their presence often goes undetected, but they're generally very common nonetheless. Adding to their secretive reputation is the fact that they're often more active at night than during the day, especially during the breeding season. The buff-banded rail is common in coastal and near-coastal districts around Australia, and it also has an extensive distribution in New Guinea, New Zealand, and islands of the southwestern Pacific. Of the 3 species of crakes widespread in southern Australia, the Australian crake is the most nomadic and least restricted to permanent wetlands. It's often common on temporary floodwaters in the interior. Also called the spotted crake, its prominent white undertail coverts and red and green bill are its most obvious field marks. Like all crakes, it nervously flicks its tail constantly as it walks. Though it usually forages alone, loose flocks occasionally form where food is temporarily abundant. Subfossil remains show that the Tasmanian native hen once occurred on the mainland, but now, as its name implies, is confined to Tasmania. Tasmanian native hens are flightless, and they live in flocks that seldom stray far from their home range. Their preferred habitat consists of swampy, tussocky grasslands near thickets on the banks of quiet rivers and streams. They are often common in farming country. Their social structure is unusual in that flocks usually consist of 1 or perhaps 2 females, each with several mates, together with their young of the previous season. Purple swamp hens occur wherever there are suitable wetlands, including ornamental ponds in city parks, especially those with dense stands of reeds. They're very common and live usually in flocks. Although they can run very nimbly, they are noticeably reluctant to swim or fly. Swamp hens will eat almost anything organic, but young grass stems make up the bulk of their diet. Parrot-like, they very often hold their food down with one foot while they peck at it. The birds persistently flick their short tails up and down, showing off their conspicuous white undertail coverts. Brolgas inhabit extensive shallow swamps, from which they scatter to forage in fields and croplands of various kinds, returning to roost together at night. Once widespread across Australia, they are now much more numerous in the tropical north than in the south. They live in permanent family groups that often congregate in much larger flocks, especially in winter. The staple diet consists of the tubers of various sedges, but brolgas also eat a wide range of seeds and roots, as well as whatever small animals, such as mice and skinks, come their way. The comb-crested jacana is notable for its extraordinary feet, with enormously elongated toes. These spread the bird's weight over a very large area and allow it to walk freely on the floating leaves of water lilies and similar aquatic vegetation that make up the jacana's world. It feeds on seeds and small aquatic animals such as pond snails and water beetles. The female takes the initiative in courtship and leaves the male to incubate her clutch of eggs and raise the chicks unaided. The nest is a floating structure of aquatic vegetation, and the eggs are coated with a glossy, waxy substance that prevents them from becoming waterlogged. Beach thick-knees frequent tropical sand beaches almost around the Indian and Western Pacific Oceans, including coastal Australia from about Shark Bay to some distance south of Brisbane. These birds feed mainly at night on crabs and similar tide zone animals. They spend much of the day resting quietly in the shade of driftwood or at the fringes of mangrove thickets. Beach thick-knees mate for life, and once established, seldom leave their territories. They're usually encountered in pairs. Much bigger than most shorebirds, oyster catchers are easily identified by their red legs and long, straight bills. Australia has two species, which differ most obviously only in plumage pattern. The pied oyster catcher is boldly black and white, but this one, the sooty oyster catcher, is entirely black. Both species occur widely along seashores around Australia, but the sooty oyster catcher shows a marked preference for rocky coasts, while the pied oyster catcher prefers sandy beaches. Sooty oyster catchers feed largely on limpets and mussels, using their long, strong bill either to lever the shells apart or to hammer them to fragments. The masked lapwing is abundant in open country across most of Australia. Noisy and demonstrative, the bird is familiar to many city dwellers, being nearly as common on urban playing fields and freeway median strips as it is on the margins of lagoons and billabongs and along the coast. Widely known as the spur-winged plover, it does indeed have a spur at the bend of each wing. But then so too do all other members of this worldwide group of birds, so the more distinctive term masked is usually preferred. Birds in the tropical north look a little different from southern birds, with longer legs, whiter faces and more pendulous facial wattles. The Pacific golden plover holds dual citizenship, nesting in summer in the high Arctic, then migrating south across the equator to spend the winter in the southern hemisphere. Stages in the journey sometimes span several thousand kilometers of open ocean, covered in a single non-stop flight. In Australia, it is among the commonest of the migratory shore birds, usually to be found on the coast, but sometimes on grassy areas inland. Outside the nesting season, its plumage is nondescript, a sort of dull spangled brown. But in March, just before leaving for the north, it begins molting into its more spectacular breeding dress, most obviously characterized by deep black underparts. Hooded plovers are resident along the coasts of southern Australia. In the southeast, small sheltered sandy beaches constitute ideal habitat, but in the southwest they are often more common around the margins of salt lakes. The birds live in resident pairs, foraging on beach fleas and similar small animals of the tide zone. In the southeast, the species is seriously endangered, largely because their habit of nesting on open beaches between the dunes and the tide line puts them at considerable risk from off-road vehicles and other forms of human disturbance. Most plovers prefer coastal environments, but the black-fronted plover differs in its preference for small freshwater swamps of almost any kind. Many farm stock dams have their resident pair of these small plovers. The bird's distribution extends right across the continent, wherever there is suitable habitat. Pairs usually forage alone, only occasionally joining with other pairs to form loose flocks. They search for seeds, insects and small aquatic animals, normally on mud and sand right at the water's edge. Dull yellow legs and a long straight bill mark the grey-tailed tattler. Fine grey bars on the flanks identify the breeding plumage, but these are lost in winter. It is one of the migratory waders, nesting in Siberia and coming to Australia only to spend the winter. A variety of small animals of the tide zone make up its diet, but small crabs are an especially favoured delicacy. Like most waders, tattlers congregate in flocks, large or small, to rest when high tide interrupts their foraging. A very long and slightly upturned bill sets the godwits apart. There are several species, but this one, the bar-tailed godwit, is the most numerous and widespread in Australia. It breeds across much of Eurasia, migrating southward across the equator to spend the winter in the southern hemisphere. As the length of its bill suggests, it probes for much of its food. Its diet consists of worms and similar animals. The birds here with reddish breasts are in the process of molting into breeding dress, while the others are in winter plumage. Godwits are strongly gregarious, often congregating in densely packed mobs. Tiniest of all the migratory waders, or at least the common ones, the red-necked stint weighs on average just over 20 grams. Yet it too, like the others, crosses the Pacific twice annually as it commutes between its wintering grounds in Australia and its Arctic breeding grounds. It prefers coastal environments, though it does occasionally visit the margins of inland swamps and billabongs. It gets its name from a brick-coloured stain on the side of the neck, but this is present only during the breeding season and is not normally seen while the birds are in Australia. Silver gulls are familiar to most Australians, though they're very much more numerous in the south than in the tropical north. They are abundant along the coast, but they also visit interior wetlands, often hundreds of kilometres inland. It usually nests in colonies on small islands just off the coast, where both parents cooperate in incubation and caring for their young. For several reasons, the silver gull has profited from European settlement and has increased its population dramatically over much of the present century. Adults have white eyes as well as bright red bills and legs, but youngsters have dark eyes. The white-fronted tern breeds in New Zealand and crosses the Tasman Sea twice annually to spend the winter in Australia. Although in recent decades a few pairs have taken to nesting on islands in the Bass Strait. While in Australia, it's mostly confined to the southeast, not often recorded outside Victoria, Tasmania and New South Wales. Birds in breeding plumage are easily identified. They have jet black bills, and few other terns are quite so crisply white. But in winter they are much less immaculate, and are then difficult to distinguish from several other tern species of similar size. Terns are very closely related to seagulls, but differ most obviously in having, usually, black caps and deeply forked tails. The crested tern is typical of the group, except in being a good deal bigger than most species. It's also perhaps the most common of all Australian terns, with the distribution extending the entire length of the coastline. though it does not visit inland waterways. The yellow bill is distinctive at all seasons, but in winter, the jet black cap of summer becomes much clouded and streaked with white. The Teresian imperial pigeon winters in New Guinea and crosses Torres Strait in spring to nest in colonies on offshore islands along Australia's northern and eastern coasts, south to about Mackay. From their colonies, the birds commute daily to the nearby mainland to forage in lowland rainforests, returning to their nests to roost at night. They usually fly low over the water in small groups. Imperial pigeons feed exclusively on rainforest fruit of various kinds, especially figs. The quiet doodle-doo call of the peaceful dove is one of the most distinctive sounds of the Australian bush, especially during the heat of the day, when most other birds are silent. It is common across much of northern and eastern Australia and often occurs in towns and cities. But the bird itself is much less conspicuous, pottering quietly about on the forest floor gathering seeds or resting motionless in a shady tree. Like most pigeons, peaceful doves build flat, flimsy nests low in the branches of trees. They lay plain white eggs. Vast hordes of flock bronzewings once roamed Australia's northern plains and grasslands, and early explorers wrote of flocks so large they took several hours to pass a given point. Those days have gone. Though the bird is still locally common, present numbers are much reduced from what they once were. Flock bronzewings are strongly nomadic. They live on treeless plains and feed almost exclusively on fallen grass seeds. At least daily, they travel great distances to waterholes to drink. On arrival, they usually settle a little way back from the water's edge and cover the last few meters on foot. But if the banks are crowded or the birds unusually eager to drink, then they often plunge right in. Largest and most spectacular of all the cockatoos, the palm cockatoo inhabits New Guinea and the remote rainforests of Cape York Peninsula. Palm cockatoos are unmistakable because of their impressive size, extravagant crest and strident calls. They're also especially difficult to overlook because of their habit of flying high from one feeding area to another and perching prominently on the tallest trees they can find. They live in pairs or small groups. For colour and spectacle, few images can equal a massed flock of galahs sweeping through the trees. In recent decades, the bird has become extremely common in several coastal cities where it did not formerly occur. Like many cockatoos, galahs feed mainly on the ground, often leaving one or two birds as lookouts on some high vantage point such as a dead tree. The sexes are nearly identical in plumage, usually differing only in eye colour. Few birds are as easy to identify as the sulphur-crested cockatoo, with its entirely white plumage and curved sulphur yellow crest. In several coastal eastern cities where its numbers have increased in recent years, it sometimes causes damage to houses by chewing roof shingles and wooden verandas, and its loud, discordant calls have prompted many a complaint to the local noise pollution control authorities. The birds tend to live in small groups in summer and large flocks in winter. They forage on the ground, usually leaving several sentinels to stand guard in nearby trees. At night, they gather in communal roost trees, seldom abandoned no matter how far the birds have to commute from it to their daily feeding grounds. The term gaudy might well have been coined with the rainbow lorikeet in mind. All the colours of the rainbow seem represented in its plumage. Rainbow lorikeets are strongly gregarious, moving from one feeding tree to another in loud, screeching flocks, and they congregate at dusk to roost in large trees, often in city parks. In the top end of tropical Australia lives a well-marked subspecies once regarded as a separate species, distinguished mainly by a band of brilliant flame orange across the hind neck. Lorikeets differ most strikingly from other parrots in their reliance on nectar for food, and they show a range of special adaptations to suit such a diet, including a brush-tipped tongue, the better to lap it up. Widely known as the quarian, the cockatiel is the smallest of the cockatoos, instantly identifiable by its grey plumage, slender pointed crest and bold white wing patches. Though both sexes have in common a dull orange cheek patch, males are much more extensively yellow around the face, chin and forehead than females. Cockatiels are strongly gregarious, usually to be found in flocks of anything up to several hundred birds. They feed on grass seeds gathered mainly on the ground, but rest and roost in trees. Though widespread across Australia, they are strongly migratory, with a marked withdrawal from the southern interior in winter. Surely the world's most popular avian pet, the budgerigar in the wild occurs in large, close-knit flocks across the arid interior of Australia. Because much of the southern interior has reliable winter rains, budgerigars arrive there and nest regularly in spring. But elsewhere, they are strongly nomadic and erratic in occurrence, settling wherever local rains have brought on a crop of grass seeds. Male and female are nearly identical in appearance, but in males, the naked, fleshy area just above the bill, technically called the cere, is normally a deeper, richer blue than in females. The eastern rosella closely resembles the larger crimson rosella, except in colour and its preference for drier, somewhat more open woodland. It is common in rural areas. Despite their abundance, Australian parrots are vulnerable because they rely on tree hollows for nesting. And in today's woodlands, trees are usually cut down long before they have a chance to develop cavities. So from the parrot's perspective, cavities represent a vital and rapidly declining resource. The eastern rosella is one of the few Australian parrots sufficiently versatile to make the switch from natural tree cavities to artificial ones, such as this old fence post. The distinctive down-slurring trill of the fan-tailed cuckoo during the courtship season is one of the most evocative sounds of the Australian bush in early spring. Cuckoos have unusual breeding habits in that the female lays her egg in the nest of some other bird, abandoning it entirely to be raised by its unwitting foster parents. In the case of the fan-tailed cuckoo, the preferred host is usually a thornbill or fairy wren of some kind. Fan-tailed cuckoos often call from hidden perches and are sometimes surprisingly difficult to locate. The yellow eye ring and boldly laddered tail are important field marks. Largest and most formidable of Australian owls, the powerful owl is confined to deep forests of the east and southeast, where it feeds largely on gliders and possums. The tail and hindquarters of the previous night's victim are often held clutched in the talons throughout the following day. It's normally active only at night, but it usually selects relatively open perches on which to roost quietly during the day. The bird may have several roost sites, several hundred meters apart, which it uses in rotation, staying several successive days at each. The tawny frogmouth is nocturnal, but contrary to widespread belief, it is not an owl. Owls have hawk-like talons and forward-facing eyes. During the day, it perches motionless and stiffly upright in a tree, relying on its uncanny resemblance to a dead stub to evade disturbance. Common almost anywhere there are trees, including city parks and gardens, the tawny frogmouth feeds mainly on large ground-living insects such as cockroaches, as well as small reptiles and even occasionally small birds. The laughing kookaburra is the largest of all kingfishers. It's also unusual among kingfishers in that it lives communally, in permanent stable groups that cooperate to raise their young. Kookaburras feed on ground-dwelling animals ranging from cockroaches to snakes, captured by pouncing on them from a vantage perch several meters from the ground. The birds don't need surface water, But to be viable, their territories must have at least one big old tree containing a suitably large cavity for nesting. Group members congregate at dawn and dusk in the familiar laughing choruses that announce their territorial boundaries to neighbouring clans. This feathered jewel, the buff-breasted paradise kingfisher, is arguably the most spectacular of Australia's birds. It breeds in coastal lowland rainforest from Cape York to the vicinity of Townsville. After nesting, it migrates to New Guinea to spend the winter. Male and female are all but indistinguishable, but in juvenile birds, the bill is dusky black rather than red. The eggs are laid in a cavity bored into termite nests, usually on or very near the ground. Bee-eaters of many kinds are common across most of Africa and Asia, but only one species, the rainbow bee-eater, inhabits Australia. It occurs across the continent, but it's only a summer migrant in the south, and large numbers cross Torres Strait twice annually to spend the winter in New Guinea. Bee-eaters are sociable birds that live on large flying insects such as bees, wasps and dragonflies, hunting them one by one in sorties from some conspicuous vantage point such as a dead tree or a telephone line. The welcome swallow feeds on small flying insects such as gnats and mosquitoes, gathered up in low, graceful flights over fields and similar open environments. It builds a nest like a half shell of mud, cemented to any vertical surface, such as a wall or rafter. It's easily distinguished from other swallows by its long, narrowly forked tail and reddish breast. The welcome swallow is abundant in farmland of all kinds, as well as in parks and playing fields in towns and cities across southern and eastern Australia. Any golfer has encountered the Richard's pipit, even though the bird was probably unnoticed as it fed inconspicuously on the greens. Richard's pipit is common in short grass environments of all kinds, and it's also one of the few passerine birds common on sand dunes behind ocean beaches. It occurs throughout Australia, including many offshore islands, and it also occurs in New Zealand. Overseas, it has an extensive distribution across much of Africa and Eurasia. It constantly tips its tail up and down as it runs, not hops over the ground, and when it flies, it displays conspicuous white outer tail feathers. It feeds entirely on small insects. One of the most widespread of all Australian birds, the black-faced cuckoo shrike is common almost anywhere there are trees. It seems to delight in flight and often swoops from tree to tree and back again for no obvious reason. When they settle, all cuckoo shrikes have a distinctive habit of fidgeting their wings into position in an exaggerated manner. The black-faced cuckoo shrike feeds high in the upper foliage of trees, usually catching large insects of various kinds, but sometimes eating fruit. The red-capped robin inhabits dry scrubs across the southern interior of Australia. In arid mallee, bullock or mulga scrub, it is sometimes the most common small bird. Like other robins, it feeds largely on the ground, pouncing on its insect prey from low perches and periodically flitting silently from one vantage point to another. Unlike many Australian songbirds, the sexes of the red-capped robin differ strikingly in appearance. The male ranks with the most colourful of birds, but the female is clad in drab grey-brown, though a hint of dull red on her forehead usually betrays her identity. A close relative of the yellow robin, the white-breasted robin is confined to the far southwestern corner of Australia, approximately from Geraldton to Esperance. Apart from the fact that its underparts are white instead of yellow, there are few obvious differences in either appearance or behaviour between the white-breasted robin and its relative. In raising their young, most robin pairs are assisted by at least one other adult, usually a grown sibling from some earlier brood. Studies have shown that assisted pairs can raise up to 3 broods per season, while unassisted pairs can raise only 1. The yellow robin is common in dense forest and woodland of various kinds over much of eastern and southern Australia, especially where there is dense shrubbery. It often occurs in urban parks and gardens. Yellow robins feed largely on terrestrial insects, which they catch by pouncing from a perch a metre or so from the ground. They have a distinctive habit of choosing the trunks of trees as vantage points, clinging sideways to the bark. Males and females are similar in appearance, but new-fledged birds look very different, dull reddish-brown and strongly streaked. The jackie-winter is common in dry open woodland and farmland across most of Australia, except Tasmania. Although nondescript in plumage, its persistent habit of flirting its boldly black and white tail makes it instantly identifiable, especially when it flies. Its song is persistent and distinctive. Like robins, jackie-winters use low perches as vantage points from which to watch for insect prey. But in the jackie-winter's case, the victim is just as likely to be in flight or among nearby foliage as on the ground. It seldom forms flocks, and pairs usually remain year-round on their territories. Eucalypts are unusual among trees in that they periodically shed their bark. This peels away in strips, which often wreath the tree in dense tangles that shelter many insects. The crested shrike tit is a specialist at exploiting this particular niche. It rummages noisily in such tangles for insects and spiders, and often uses its short, sharp, powerful bill to tear at bark to expose grubs under the surface. Most foraging takes place in the canopy of tall forest trees. The sexes are similar, except that the chin is black in males, dark green in females. Named for the fluffy white feathers on its nape, the frilled monarch inhabits dense rainforest, though it sometimes visits adjacent eucalypt woodland to forage. In Australia, it is restricted to Cape York, though it is widespread in New Guinea. Farther south, on the Atherton tableland in northeastern Queensland, lives a closely related species, the pied monarch, which differs most conspicuously in having a broad black band across the breast. Frilled monarchs forage either in the canopy or by searching the lower trunks of rainforest trees, methodically searching them in spiralling climbs from near the ground to the level of the lower limbs. To most country people, the willy wagtail is nearly as familiar as the kookaburra and the magpie, but it also occurs in city parks. In fact, it's widespread across Australia in open country of all kinds, from interior deserts through farmland to urban parks and gardens. It's sometimes mistaken for the restless flycatcher, but it has a black throat. The restless flycatcher's entire underparts are white. The white eyebrow stripe varies in prominence with the mood of its owner. Under stress or excitement, it is bold, bushy and conspicuous, but it is often barely noticeable at other times. Despite their relatively small size, willy wagtails are bold and aggressive birds, and pairs think nothing of joining forces to harass kookaburras or even eagles off their territory. Aptly named, the eastern whipbird is easily identified by its call alone. A long whistle followed by an explosive crack. Nothing else in the bush sounds quite like it. Catching a glimpse of the bird that utters the call is quite another matter. The whipbird forages in dense cover, usually close to the ground, but occasionally higher up in the middle levels of the forest. It can seldom be coaxed into allowing a good, clear view of it. But the merest glimpse is usually enough to identify it. Nothing else that behaves like it is quite so big or quite so dark, and the bushy crest and white cheeks are distinctive. The eastern whipbird inhabits rainforest and similar dense woodland almost all along the east coast, though it does not occur in Tasmania. Grey-crowned babblers are common across much of northern and eastern Australia. They live in the shrub layer of dry open woodland, foraging on the ground, in the undergrowth and among fallen timber. Grey-crowned babblers live in close-knit groups of about 12, made up of a core breeding pair and several generations of their grown young. All group members share in nest building, incubation and feeding the chicks. Grey-crowned babblers are aptly named. The pale grey cap is the most obvious feature that distinguishes them from Australia's other 3 babbler species. The sexes are similar in appearance and young resemble adults. The golden-headed cisticola is a common Australian representative of a family of songbirds, the Old World warblers, that are diverse and abundant across Africa and Eurasia, but have very few members in Australia. It's especially common in rank, weedy pasture and rough paddocks of the kind that often extend from the margins of lagoons and swamps. In breeding males, the head is rich, tawny buff, but in winter it is heavily streaked with black. Females resemble winter males. The superb fairy wren is confined to forests and woodlands in southeastern Australia, including Tasmania. It needs dense shrubbery for shelter, but more than most fairy wrens, it requires open areas over which to forage, so urban parks and gardens often suit it very well. Contrary to common folklore, most superb fairy wren flocks contain only one female, the matriarch, who evicts her daughters but tolerates her sons. The confusion arises because immature males and females are almost indistinguishable, both sexes wearing dull brown plumage. Only fully mature males, at least 4 or 5 years old, are permanently blue. The red-backed fairy wren is in many ways the tropical representative of the superb fairy wren. Also, like other fairy wrens, only males older than about 4 or 5 years wear the brilliant black and red badges of maturity year-round. Females and immatures are dull brown. Younger males don the scarlet finery only during the breeding season. It is abundant in blady grass and similar habitats across northern and eastern Australia, extending southward in coastal districts almost to Newcastle. In body size, the southern emu wren is very nearly the smallest of all Australian birds, though its extremely long tail gives a distorted impression of total length. Its tail feathers are extremely unusual in structure, or more precisely, lack of it. A bird's feather is normally held together as a coherent surface by very large numbers of minute, hook-like structures called barbicels. However, these are lacking in the emu wren's tail feathers, which appear distinctly filmy and insubstantial as a result. Southern emu wrens live in pairs or small parties in low, dense coastal heaths in southern Australia. The eastern bristlebird is a birdwatcher's bird in the sense that few other people would ever suspect its existence. Although a little larger than many other songbirds, it is plain dull brown in colour, extremely secretive in habits, and rigidly confined to heathland of a very particular kind. To see one, you need to plan your expedition carefully. It lives on the ground in dense cover, where it feeds on insects and seeds. It's extremely reluctant to fly, and when flushed usually travels only a few meters low over the vegetation before diving back into dense cover. Usually, only its abrupt metallic calls betray its presence. Almost confined to New South Wales, it has a very local and disconnected distribution in lowland and highland heaths near the coast. The white-throated Gerygone inhabits coastal and near-coastal woodlands across northern and eastern Australia. In the southeast it is strongly migratory, and its persistent, frail, melodious song is one of the earliest signs of spring in the bush. The bird itself is inconspicuous, as it usually remains high in the upper foliage of eucalypt trees, where it's difficult to watch. The white throat and clear yellow underparts are diagnostic. Unlike several other thornbill species, the brown thornbill lives in small family parties rather than flocks, though it often joins roving mixed species thornbill flocks in winter. It inhabits wooded country of all kinds, generally feeding in the shrubbery and lower branches of the trees and leaving the ground below and the foliage canopy above to thornbills of other species. Small insects make up its diet. Thornbills are all confusingly similar in appearance, but the brown thornbill's red eye and faintly streaked breast are useful clues to its identity. Whitefaces are small, brown, open country birds, confined to the southern half of the Australian continent. They differ from their close relatives, the thornbills, most significantly in their diet of seeds rather than insects. Two species are restricted to deserts of the interior, but the southern whiteface is common in dry paddocks and sparsely wooded country of all kinds all across the south. Southern whitefaces live in small resident groups. They forage inconspicuously on the ground and are usually noticed only when inadvertently flushed. Then they typically perch on fence wires or fallen timber until the disturbance has passed. The varied Sitella is one of those unusual birds that are instantly identifiable by behavior alone. No other Australian bird scuttles over the bark of trees in this busy, mouse-like manner. Sitellas occur almost everywhere there are trees, but the species is absent from Tasmania. They live in permanent groups of about a dozen or more. The birds are not truly nomadic, but they stay on the move, patrolling a home range so extensive that it may be some time before they happen to revisit any particular spot. The brown tree creeper behaves very much like all other tree creepers, except that it belies its name by spending a good deal of time foraging on the ground as well as on the bark of trees. It is insectivorous, but ants in particular make up much of its diet. The brown tree creeper is widespread across the eastern half of the Australian continent, but not Tasmania, in dry woodlands and open country, but usually more numerous in the interior than near the coast. It lives in groups of half a dozen or so individuals. The noisy friar bird is one of the most widespread representatives of a group of honey-eaters with naked heads, a feature most unusual among songbirds. It is common across much of eastern Australia, from Victoria to Cape York. In the south it is migratory, but in the tropics it's only locally nomadic. Aptly named, the birds frequently congregate in noisy, squabbling flocks at profusely flowering eucalypts and similar trees. They also eat fruit and catch insects, and occasionally cause damage in orchards. One of the most spectacular of all honey-eaters, the regent honey-eater, has become extremely rare over the past few decades, and now remains common in only a few localities on the western slopes of the Great Dividing Range. Once it congregated in flocks of sometimes several hundred at groves of flowering eucalypts, but now it's rare to see more than 10 or so together. The exact cause of the decline remains uncertain. Several other honey-eaters have large amounts of black and yellow in the plumage, but only the regent honey-eater is scalloped rather than streaked. Few animals in the world live in such intricately structured communities as the noisy myna. Each adult female noisy myna has several male consorts which live together as a unit along with several young of previous seasons. A typical noisy myna community is made up of dozens of such family units. Noisy mynas are unusually flexible in their foraging behavior. They search for food on the ground, on bark, at flowers or in foliage, and their diet is a smorgasbord of insects, fruit and nectar. The New Holland honey-eater is common on the coastal heathlands of southeastern and southern Australia. It is heavily dependent on nectar for food, and it forages mainly at flowering banksias, grevilleas and eucalypts. Occasionally it catches insects in flight. New Holland honey-eaters are aggressive birds that vigorously defend their own little patch of flowering shrub from other honey-eaters. But sooner or later, the nectar source fails and the birds must move on in search of other plants ready to flower. The call of the spotted pardalote is well known to many people, including city dwellers, even though the tiny bird itself is usually very hard to see, keeping as it does to dense foliage in the very tops of trees. The tree is almost invariably a eucalypt of some species, and the birds, like all pardalotes, feed mainly on lerp, a sugary substance secreted by a particular kind of insect found only in eucalypts. Spotted pardalotes build their nests in burrows dug into the ground, often just below the rim of the earthen banks of streams or cuttings alongside roads or railway lines. Probably more people have silver eyes in their gardens than any other Australian native bird. It's common almost anywhere there is shrubbery, and it's fond of introduced and often pest species such as privet and lantana. It eats insects and fruit. It's widespread in southern and eastern Australia, including Tasmania. Tasmanian birds are largely migratory, crossing Bass Strait twice each year to spend the winter in Victoria and eastern New South Wales. The birds spend much of the year in small wandering flocks, from which pairs drop out to nest, then rejoin when their young have grown. The beautiful firetail is easy to identify because no other grassfinch normally occurs in its particular habitat. Dense heathlands in coastal districts of southeastern Australia and Tasmania. Like other grassfinches, it feeds on grass seeds, gathered either on the stem or on the ground, together with whatever small insects it might happen to encounter. Also, like other grassfinches, beautiful firetails visit water frequently to drink, and they are very fond of bathing. Much less sociable than their relatives, they are normally more often encountered in pairs than in flocks. Next to the budgerigar and the cockatiel, the zebra finch is one of the most popular of all bird pets around the world. Zebra finches normally live in large, dense flocks, sometimes hundreds strong. They feed together on the ground and roost and shelter in bushes and trees during the heat of the day. Like other grass finches, they come frequently to water to drink, sometimes almost hourly. Males have a dull orange cheek patch, lacking in the female. As a wild bird, it occurs right across Australia, apparently almost equally at home in the most arid of deserts or in farmlands near the coast. Once common in tropical grasslands across northern Australia, the beautiful Gouldian finch is now endangered. Its range reduced to about half its former extent. Trapping, overburning and viral infections have all been implicated. The Gouldian finch is unusual in that it is the only Australian grass finch that habitually nests in tree cavities. Other species build woven nests of grass. Gouldian finches live in permanent groups of up to 50 birds or so. They feed on grass seeds taken from the stem, not from the ground. The sexes are similar, though the female is usually much duller than her mate, but individuals may have red, black or, rarely, yellowish heads. The Regent bowerbird is notable in that it has the most spectacular plumage and builds the smallest bower of any Australian bowerbird. It inhabits rainforests of eastern Australia, roughly from Mackay to Sydney. Though the bower is built on the ground, the bird spends most of its time in the middle levels of the forest, feeding mainly on fruit. The female looks very different from the male, and is best identified by her blackish crown and chin and her pale face. In Australia, the fawn-breasted bowerbird is confined to woodlands on Cape York Peninsula, but the same bird is also widespread in southern New Guinea. It differs most obviously from its relatives by its pale tan underparts. Like most other bowerbirds, the male fawn-breasted bowerbird builds a bower consisting essentially of two parallel walls of sticks on a central stage. The male entices any female he can attract between the walls to mate, after which she leaves to build a nest and raise her brood of chicks entirely unaided. White-browed wood swallows live permanently in large flocks. They are widespread across the Australian continent, but much more numerous in the east than in the west. Their occurrence is highly erratic, though there is a broad tendency to move northward in autumn, south in spring. Several years may go by without a sighting, then they descend in large numbers. Their erratic lifestyle affects their behavior in other ways. Breeding usually begins immediately on arrival. But their nomadic tendencies sometimes get the better of them midway through the nesting cycle, and it's not unknown for the entire flock to vanish, leaving nests, eggs and chicks abandoned. Instantly identifiable by the strange yet melodious flight calls as a disturbed flock takes to flight. The white-winged chough is widespread in dry woodlands of various kinds across the southeastern corner of Australia. The white wing patches from which it gets its name are obvious in flight, but hidden when the wings are closed. The birds feed exclusively on the ground, but fly up into trees when disturbed. White-winged choughs are strongly social in everything they do. They even nest together. All group members, for example, take turns in incubating the eggs and fetching food for the chicks. The apostle bird got its name from a widespread rural belief that the bird lives always, like the original followers of Jesus, in flocks of 12. A belief very nearly true, though the number is seldom exactly 12. The group or clan usually consists of a dominant breeding pair, together with their progeny of several years, and may occasionally reach 16 or 20 in number. Everything that apostle birds do, they do together. Only one nest is built, but clan members divide the labour of incubation and gathering food for the chicks more or less equally among themselves. Once most abundant on the margins of swamps and lagoons, the magpie lark has profited from European settlement and is now common in many urban environments such as parks and playing fields. It occurs across Australia but is rare in Tasmania. The head pattern differs in detail with age and sex. Males have a black chin and white eyebrows, females have black eyebrows but a white chin and forehead, and juveniles have white eyebrows and a white chin. Magpie larks usually mate for life and defend permanent territories about 10 hectares in extent. Young birds commonly form roving flocks. Butcherbirds are predators that feed on a wide range of small animals, captured on the ground in sudden pounces from some higher vantage point, such as a fence post or telephone line. The various species tend to distribute themselves according to habitat, and the grey butcherbird is the one most closely associated with open forest and woodland. It's common in suitable habitat across Australia. Adults form permanent pairs that seldom leave their territories, and they advertise its boundaries by intricate singing performances in which each bird contributes alternate phrases. Notorious for its habit of nesting in schoolyards and dive-bombing school children playing beneath, the Australian magpie is a common urban and suburban bird across much of Australia, especially in the east and south. The rich, carolling song is among the most widely familiar of all Australian bird sounds. The birds often sing in chorus, and individuals also commonly sit in some shady tree, warbling softly to themselves. Geographical variation is intricate, but basically there are two kinds of magpie, those with black backs in the north and those with white backs in the south. The Australian magpie lives in small groups that roost communally at night. It needs trees in which to nest and roost, and open areas in which to forage, but so long as both features are present, its habitat requirements are extremely flexible.